Hi guys, this is Tig again, and I'm returning with my second video after saying that I probably wouldn't make another one um, because after my first one, it seemed like some of the feedback that I got was the information was too vague. Even though I gave some specific tips on how to make money, for example, when I was talking about rares, I didn't really point out anything too specific about what makes rares good. And I know there are a lot of guides out there that'll tell you to look for, for example, high life and resists on a helm or, um, you know, high DPS on a weapon, whatever. Um, and again, people complain that it's too generic. So I thought what I would do here is give you a price guide on two of the more meta builds for this league. And unfortunately, by the time I had the item for by the time I had the idea for this, it's so late in the league. But maybe next league I'll do it a little bit sooner, within the first couple weeks. But the two builds that I'm going to do this for are Blade Vortex, specifically an ES based crit Blade Vortex, and Facebreaker Warchief Totems, which I think are, really the two most defining builds so far of the league. Now, more recently, we've seen some LE conversion barrage, poison barrage, um, some Starforge builds become a little bit more popular, but kind of from the start of the league, these two builds have been what have been driving a lot of the market. So let's get into it. I'm going to start with my Facebreaker Totem character. A lot of this will be able to apply to two-hand totems as well, and I'll try to point out a couple differences here and there, but for the most part it's going to focus on the Facebreaker side of things. So I'm just going to go through point by point here. Let's start off with the helm. Facebreaker totems will almost always use Abyssus. There are a few builds out there, mostly geared towards hardcore, that'll use Bringer of Rain with the Scion with Ascendant. But anyway, for softcore at least, Abyssus is what most are using. And here the two most important stats are the increased physical damage taken and the all attributes, because Facebreakers are going to face problems both with defense, so you really can't afford a higher physical damage taken roll, and they also have a few issues getting enough attributes to use everything that they use. The melee critical strike multiplier can be ignored entirely, and for the most part, so can the increased armor. If it's high, it's a little bonus. Um, Enchant wise, there are a few enchants actually that are okay with Facebreaker totems. Um, One is obviously the direct Warchief totem damage. There's another one that gives a bonus to the portion of the Warchief skill that says 18% more melee damage while totem is active. There's another enchant that says you'll get 30% increased melee damage while the totem is active as well. Both of those are pretty good. So is Flame Golem buff effect. So is Vulnerability curse effect. Temporal Chains curse effect. Hatred or Herald of Ash mana reservation. And this one, Warchief Totem Radius, I just got this on a random run and decided to stop. It's pretty good for map clear, obviously, and it's not going to do anything for bosses, but it could add a little bit of value to your Abyssus. Let's move on to the chest. With Facebreakers, almost all of the builds out there are using either a very well rolled Astral Plate or a Belly of the Beast. With the Astral Plate, the normal rare guidelines apply. You want high life, high armor, and high resists. And actually having the Astral Plate will ease up some of your resistance requirements elsewhere. For a Belly of the Beast, you want to look for obviously high life and high resists. 40% increased maximum life and 15 resists are the maximum rolls for both. Overall, the resistance roll is more important because any Facebreaker totem build will have so much increased life on the tree anyway that the 30 to 40% increased maximum life, the range makes minimal difference. You know, it's life on 1 joule essentially. Um, this is probably something that's a little bit more interesting to discuss. For the amulet slot, really there are only three damage stats that Facebreaker totems can use. There's flat damage to attacks, by far the most important. Um, there is percent increased damage, obviously, and there's attack speed. Um, since it's not a crit build, accuracy doesn't matter, critical strike stats don't matter. I'm trying to think of what else actually even I gear for, but pretty much nothing. So, this amulet, um, because there are so few stats that matter, you essentially can be very flexible with jewelry on Facebreaker totems. But, and actually I should have shown this at the start, there are a couple things that you can do to min-max your passive tree. So a lot of Facebreaker totem builds are going to be taking Faith and Steel and Cloth and Chain because resists are such an issue on the build with the number of uniques that you use. But you can get as much as possible on your gear, obviously, to try to ease up on your passive tree. Nothing beats a top tier physical damage to attack roll. That is most important. Second most important is a high life roll. The reason this particular necklace is so good for Facebreaker totems is 1, those two stats, 2, the base. Dexterity is extremely important for Facebreaker totems. 3, the dual res suffixes, and 4, the dexterity suffix. You can see here that I have 177 dex. Valhaste takes 155, so I actually exalted the dexterity on this necklace after crafting the cold res and was extremely happy because it allowed me to free up some passive points and not have to care about dexterity elsewhere in my gear, obviously. So if you're looking past those two stats, resistances, dexterity, and intelligence actually are going to be what add the most value. Following that, mana regeneration can also be very useful for a totem build. So my perfect amulet, I can't really think of a prefix right now, I guess percent increased armor, but my perfect amulet for a totem build would be life, physical damage to attacks, increased armor, high tier either dexterity or intelligence, high tier resistances, and a high tier mana regen roll. With mana regen being the least desirable. Let's move on to Void Heart, another unique that's used in the build. There's not much to say about this ring. The maximum life goes from 20 to 30, and these poison and bleed rolls, I believe bleed goes from 30 to 50, and poison goes from 20 to 40. The most important roll is the chance to poison on hit. Because bleed does not stack as long as your totems hit, you know, my totems hit 3 times a second. So you're going to get a bleed on the target pretty quickly regardless, and it'll keep applying. Poison stacking, though, means that a percent chance to poison, an increase in your percent chance to poison directly adds damage over time. Let's move on to the other ring here. Similar to the amulet, you really want a steel ring base here. You can make your resistances work without resistances on the ring, and steel rings are one of the few ways to get physical damage to attacks into the build. But other than that, again, you're basically looking for high life, high physical damage to attacks. This particular roll is a deafening contempt roll. And apart from that, evasion is okay. It helps a little defensively. The accuracy on this ring means nothing, as I'm Resolute Technique. And then and then again, dexterity, resistances, mana regeneration, intelligence. All of these are going to be extremely useful for meeting the requirements of a Facebreaker build. Great Old One's Ward, also useful. Here, the attack speed doesn't make as big of a difference. The range is pretty narrow. I think it's 5 to 10% or 6 to 10%, something like that. You again want to look for maximizing your maximum life and physical damage to attacks. 12 to 20 is the maximum roll. Meganord's Girdle. This is an item that almost does not vary at all. You want 20% cold res if you can. It's a very cheap item. There's really not much to say beyond that. Facebreakers. Obviously the key to the build, you want the percent more unarmed physical damage as high as possible. 800 is perfect. It ranges from 600 to 800. Useful corruptions here include basically just Curse with vulnerability on hit. I've been looking to get a pair at 790 plus, but since I run temporal chains on blasphemy while mapping, it really only matters for shaper kills, and I haven't been willing to give up my percent overall damage. But those can add significant value. 790 plus pairs, I think the last one I saw selling was going for about 12 exalts. So just like with snake bites and Verusos, you can definitely make some money trying to vol these. Finally, boots. This is where Facebreaker builds get their resists. They have no desire for any of the unique pairs of boots, really, and two-tone boots have been a godsend. This pair, I believe it totals up to something like 163% total resistance, which is insane. I'm Ellie weakness capped on this character, and these boots are a big part of the reason why. I think I bought these for about 4 exalts early in the league. Most important on any pair of boots is going to be your resists and your movement speed. You really want 30% increased movement speed as Facebreakers because you're so squishy with Abyssus against physical damage. You really need to be able to get away from stuff, avoid stuff, and boots are crucial to that, obviously. A huge life roll is great, but for the most part, boots are really hard to roll to be perfect when you require the 30% increased movement speed. I mean, they're kind of similar to weapons in that you want 2 prefixes and all your suffixes. So, crafted life is actually not bad on boots compared to the maximum you can get. You can get 64, I believe, is the maximum for crafted, and 89 is the top of tier 1 life, so you're not losing too much if you have to settle for crafted life. That's also a great way to look for deals if you're in the market for buying them. Just search for 30% increased movement speed and huge resists and see what you can come up with. Flasks, I'm not going to go over the health flasks here. Lion's Roar is great. This is a crap roll. But it ranges from 30 to 35% more melee physical damage. Also useful is Atziri's Promise. This is a perfect roll, 25 and 15, and additionally a Taste of Hate if you feel like using it. I don't think it's crucial on this build because so much of your damage is coming from bleed and poison, and I've never had issues defensively, but so it goes. A lot of what I've talked about here has been uniques, and I think you're going to see that even when I switch over to talk about Blade Vortex, something to keep in mind about any rares that you're trying to price is the most expensive rares are going to be the ones that allow more uniques to be used. That's why these 3 are, I don't know how much they cost right now. I'm not, when I'm talking about prices here, I'm just trying to tell you what is good on an item. I can't tell you how the market is going to change at any given point, and I haven't priced these items right now. But these 3 in particular are great because they allow me to use more uniques. I get the dexterity and I get the resistances that allow me not to care about what's going on with my belt and my gloves and my shield and my armor and my ring slot. Um, it also frees up passives, as I mentioned. So let's look at the passive tree for a moment. The gear. Oh, sorry. And the second thing that rares will allow you to do is free up passive points, as I touched on earlier. And you can see here that I haven't had to take any of the big dexterity or intelligence nodes around the Marauder area because I have it on my tree. I do, because of how I've geared, I do take this mana regen node, which I have deemed is more efficient for me compared to getting mana regen on my gear. And so I've saved 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 passive points on resists, 6, 7 really, on attributes compared to what somebody with less optimized gear might have. Let's talk about jewels for a moment. Jewels are pretty straightforward for totems. You're going to want totem damage, physical damage, melee damage, area damage, um, attack speed, or the attack and cast speed. What else is there? The generic damage mod. Um, physical damage while holding a shield, attack speed while holding a shield. Any of those are very useful. Stay away from specifically, oh, and obviously maximum life is useful. Specifically avoid the jewels that say anything with a one-handed weapon, because face breakers do not count as a one-handed weapon. They count as unarmed. This jewel is, just a 3 property jewel. I need the life and resistances to work. And see, I could upgrade this jewel now because I no longer need that dexterity. I think the rest are pretty decent. I basically have 3 property jewels everywhere. So let me just briefly touch on how this would change for a 2-handed totem build. So 2-handed totems are going to be using Starforge or Disfavor at the high end, or just a high DPS rare. They're going to get rid of Abyssus, which is really the biggest benefit to going 2-hand, and instead they're going to either use a big rare helmet with a great enchant. That's really the only reason to use a rare helmet, is if you get some insane enchant on them, and the enchantments that are useful remain the same as what I listed earlier. The other possibility is Devotos for the attack speed and movement speed. The chest slot is either going to remain the same, or you can afford to move up to a Comb's Heart as 2-handed. The stats on the Combs don't matter. A +1 max res implicit is great, but becomes significantly more expensive. Importantly, the steel ring is still very nice, but the flat damage implicit is not as important when you... do I have a 2-handed weapon here? I don't think so. When you have so much damage coming from the weapon itself, you don't have to care as much about flat damage to attacks. You still want the big life rolls, you still want the resistances, you still want mana regeneration and attributes. You do get a little bit more flexibility with your glove slot. You don't need to take face breakers. The most useful ones would be spiked gloves, the ones with the melee damage implicit. And because of that, you're going to roll attack speed as a suffix, maybe flat fizz damage as a prefix, but you still get 2 suffixes open for resists. And that eases up on the gearing a lot. Your belt slot also becomes a lot more flexible. You can use a rustic sash with high life, or a leather belt with high life and resistances, instead of having to use Meganoids. And obviously you won't have a shield anymore. The boots remain the same. Let's move on and talk about Blade Vortex. My Blade Vortex character this league is Tricurse Occultist, so it's not quite the same as Pathfinder. but you'll see that a lot of it remains the same. So let's again start with the helm. I use a Heretic's Veil for Tricurse, but CI Pathfinder or Lowlife Pathfinder prefers a Hubris Circlet with high energy shield, which is all that matters for a prefix, and resistances as the suffix, or intelligence. Intelligence in an energy shield build takes on a different importance than strength or dexterity or intelligence in a life-based build, because of its direct contribution to your global percent increased energy shield. I know strength also does provide life um, in a life-based build, but you really don't tend to stack as much strength because it's not as efficient. Intelligence is extremely nice in an ES build, and so intelligence can actually sometimes add more value than a high tier resistance on a hubris. For enchantments, any of the auras that Pathfinders or low-life Blade Vortex builds use, any of the aura reservation enchants for those auras can be useful. That includes Hatred, Haste, Discipline, Herald of Ice. I guess that's about it off the top of my head. Also, you can get any of the Blade Vortex enchants. Blade Vortex Duration, Blade Vortex Damage are the two most expensive. Blade Vortex Radius is also good, but not as important. You can also get curse effects, particularly if you're looking at somebody using a Heretic's Veil. Vulnerability curse effect, temp chains, or enfeeble are all extremely nice. On a shield is one of the few slots where you can not only gear for defense but also offense. Obviously, a shield carries with it its own defensive value with chance to block, and it's going to be, actually, if you're low life, it's going to be your largest source of energy shield. If you're CI, it'll be second to your chest. But it also turns out you can get some huge damage stats on an energy shield. Including the spell damage roll that you see here, and critical strike chance to spells as a suffix. You can also get mana regen as a suffix, which is extremely important to Blade Vortex in most situations. So when you're looking at a shield, number one priority is at least the two energy shield prefixes, pure percent energy shield and flat energy shield. You want both of those to be as high as possible, ideally to total up to 500 plus energy shield. If you have a third energy shield prefix, you can get up to 600 plus. Otherwise, you would prefer spell damage. A big flat mana roll can add some value to a shield, but it's really just either spell damage or a third energy shield prefix. For suffixes, spell crit is the most valuable because it's so much more efficient on a shield compared to anything else. For example, you can get 109 critical strike chance to spells on a shield. Think about the fact that that only replaces 45 resistance as a suffix, which you can make up for by giving up a diamond ring base if you need to, and getting a 2-stone ring instead, or even both of your diamond ring bases. You're still gaining crit and gaining resistance. The same with mana regeneration. You can get 60% mana regeneration on a shield and give up one of your ring implicits if you really need the mana regeneration. Other than that, the same as the hubris. You really want big resistances or a big intelligence roll. Let's switch over to the weapon here. There are four important stats on a weapon: spell damage, critical strike chance for spells, global multiplier, and increased attack speed. Increased attack speed is really only for whirling blade speed, and the weapon, the attacks per second of the weapon itself does not matter. It's just the attack speed explicit modifier that will affect whirling blades. Also important is the dagger base. You want an 80% global critical strike base because that directly impacts blade vortex as much as possible, and you really don't have to care about the DPS of the weapon at all. Flat damage to spells is okay. It's nothing special because Blade Vortex's damage multiplier is so good, but if you do get some, it can add a little bit of value, especially if you get high tier lightning damage or cold damage to spells, because they can help with freezing and shocking enemies. Um, Other than that, there's not a whole lot to say with the weapon. Do note that critical strike chance for the weapon does not affect Blade Vortex at all and does not add any value to a caster weapon. I've spoken about amulets a little bit on my previous video. For casters, the best base is a citrine amulet, which adds strength and dexterity. Next to that is an onyx. Generally, Blade Vortex builds are going to use amulets for pure damage. So there are, well, pure damage and energy shield, I should say. You're not going to be getting too much utility. So the most ideal amulet, in my opinion, would be spell damage, flat energy shield prefix, a percent increased maximum energy shield prefix, both of the crit suffixes that you see here, and then you have one last utility suffix. Dexterity, strength, or mana regeneration can all add significant value to an amulet. And in this case, I actually exalted the dexterity on here, so I was extremely happy. The chest. You're either going to be using a Val Regalia or for CI or Shavs for low life. On Shavs, the only thing that really matters is the increased energy shield roll. Lightning resistance is nice, but nobody's going to be judging you if you have a 30% lightning resistance roll, and there's really not a whole lot else to say about Shavs. On a Val Regalia, it really acts a lot the same as the Hubris. You want big energy shield and big resistances, or a big intelligence roll as a suffix. On rings, there are very few mods on a ring that matter. And actually, before I continue here, I should say on an amulet, the other thing that can matter is cast speed as a suffix, because stacking Blade Vortex does matter. Cast speed doesn't directly impact damage though, so I would say that's probably the least valuable of the suffixes, except for some CI Pathfinder builds don't really have to care about attributes as much as I do as an occultist. So on a ring, the suffixes are resistances or mana regen. Nothing else matters that I can think of. So as long as you have 3 big suffixes, you want a big flat ES roll, or percent increased maximum energy shield. You can also try to get a big flat mana roll, which can help with total amount of mana available with a ton of aura reservation. This really applies to both rings, and ideally you want a diamond ring implicit. I need the fire resistance, so I use a ruby ring, and as I mentioned earlier, ideally I want to get spell crit on this shield at some point in the future. This ring hasn't really been crafted yet, so don't worry about that. Let's move on to gloves. I use Shadows and Dust. Also useful are Malagaros or Facebreakers for unique gloves. Facebreakers give you the most single target damage with global critical strike multiplier. Malagaros provide some dexterity, static attack speed, and better crit and crit multi than, I think it's only better crit strike chance, not as much critical strike multiplier as Shadows and Dust. And Shadows and Dust are the overall best mapping gloves because of the speed provided by Rampage, the Unholy Might, and Smoke Clouds for safety, along with good crit stats. However, CI Pathfinder, if you're looking at, or really even my build as an occultist, if you're looking at some rare gloves, either big energy shield gloves that use the same guidelines as as the Hubris and the Ba Regalia can be extremely nice in settling your resistances, or very possibly you can get an Insanity craft, which I think most people know about now. With Socketed Gems have 20% more attack and cast speed, and put Whirling Blades in there. This allows for extremely quick movement around the map and can actually be faster than Shadows and Dust because it's always up and doesn't depend on Rampage. But you do lose some damage in terms of the crit stats. I use a Headhunter. This is not at all important for Blade Vortex. It's important for an Occultist because I get Strength and Dex from it. And the implicit is extremely nice in terms of the skill effect duration. That'll add quite a bit of value if you're talking about high-end items for Blade Vortex. But most people will be using a crystal belt, and I have no idea what this has on it. The crystal belt is going to be following the same guidelines as most of the other energy shield gear. But there's an important thing to note here. So I mentioned intelligence on a helm earlier. Well, it turns out that there are 3 slots, being the helm, the gloves, and your belt. Belts can only get strength, gloves can only get dex, and your helm can only get intelligence. But we already discussed that intelligence is really only about percent energy shield. Blade Vortex builds need a lot of strength and a lot of dexterity, in particular dexterity. And so dex on your gloves as a suffix and strength on your belt as a suffix can add a lot of value. If they're not using a crystal belt, they're generally going to be using a heavy belt for even more strength. Other than that, there are a few flask mods for Pathfinder. Flask effect duration and reduced flask charges used can add a huge amount of value to a belt, especially when paired with a big flat energy shield roll as a prefix and a big armor roll as a prefix. If you get both of those flask mods on there and it still has an open prefix, they can then craft percent movement speed from Torah, and it's basically one of the best belts possible for Blade Vortex. For boots, as an occultist, I get the option of taking power charge on crit, and so Skyforts are kind of a luxury item for me. They allow me to fit in a couple more auras, and they allow me to take Vile Bastion because I get power charge on crit. They are best in slot in general for any Blade Vortex build, because they allow you to free up gem slots as a Pathfinder. You no longer need to use power charge on crit either in your Blade Vortex setup or in an alternate Blade Vortex setup, or Orb of Storms, however you do it. And the mana reservation is crucial for most Blade Vortex builds because they're trying to shove in as many auras as possible. Enchantments that matter include the attack and cast speed if you've killed recently here, which is great for mapping. Otherwise, Leech if you've killed recently is great for when you don't have flasks up. I think that's all the gear slots here. Then let's talk about flasks. My flasks on this character are just kind of roughshod, but we've talked about Vinctar in my previous video. You want specifically the conversion Vinctar because of the amount of physical damage you're doing as Blade Vortex. It provides a ginormous amount of leech. You can also do damage to spells, which in most cases, except for the absolute highest content, will give you plenty of leech and you'll be fine. The damage to attacks and penetration Vinctars can be useful as a Pathfinder because you'll still have plenty of uptime and you can use physical to lightning in your gem setup and still get plenty of leech from them, or actually more leech than if you just used a conversion Vinctar, but you're losing damage using physical to lightning because of the scaling. As an occultist, I need a grounding flask to counteract the downside of Vinctar, but This is not necessary as a Pathfinder. Um, I use a Basalt because I'm not using a Taste of Hate right now. A Pathfinder would generally replace this flask with a Taste of Hate. Um, Other useful flasks include Rumi's Concoction for block. Pathfinder in particular will get near max block just from their flask effect and Rumi's, combined with their shield. And Etziri's Promise here. Overwhelming, Overflowing Chalice is also useful as a Pathfinder for flask sustain. I think that's pretty much it. Oh, Kiara's Determination also has some value because of its immunity to stun and freeze, which is great for CI and low life builds. Um, I think that's generally it. I hope this provides some insight into how I look at items, particularly rares this league, because Warchief and Blade Vortex drive so much of the market right now. For example, this amulet, you can see that just these four stats: critical strike, chance, critical strike, multiplier, energy shield, and maximum energy shield. If you manage to get an amulet with just those four, um, you can probably sell it for about an Exalt right now, if not more, depending on the tiers, because there's so many Blade Vortex builds that care about those four stats. Um, Same goes with shields, which are extremely popular to craft right now with woes. The spell damage and spell crit that are available on one are highly sought after, and you can make a lot of money if you manage to craft one of those. Let me know what you think about my video, and maybe I'll be once again convinced to make another one this league, otherwise maybe earlier next league. Thanks.